Welcome, you're watching World Talks, where every word matters. I'm your host, Klaudia Czerwińska. The deed is done. Donald Trump is officially the 47th president of the United States, and he's back in the Oval Office. It would be fitting to say the dust is setting, but is it? Donald Trump announced a flurry of changes and orders to be imposed immediately, changing the shape of the U.S. administration as we've known it in the last 4 years. What is Trump's second term going to change in relation to the EU and Poland? Joining me now to discuss the takeaways from today's inaugural speech is Daniel Fried, former U.S. ambassador to Poland. Thank you so much for joining me here on the program during such an eventful day.
Thanks for having me. Dobry wieczór.
Dobry wieczór. So in your opinion, have we heard anything during today's address that changes how Trump's second term is going to be seen and how it's going to unfold, possibly compared also to the first term in office?
We heard a great deal of what Trump's team had told us to expect. That is a great emphasis on security on the southern border, a great emphasis on expelling undocumented or illegal immigrants. We heard a somewhat less dark picture of America than in his first inaugural address 8 years ago. We did hear, however, a threat to retake the Panama Canal, which I don't think is real. It is intended, I suppose, to appeal to his base and frighten the Panamanian government into certain concessions. And we heard also one, I think, frivolous suggestion to rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, which
yes, indeed,
advances no U.S. interest I can see. But this was an expected speech, and I wasn't terribly surprised by anything in it.
You mentioned the expectations, and you put an emphasis on that very word, expectations versus reality. What are the things that were mentioned today are actually going to be enforced? And do you think that they're going to be enforced anytime soon, or we will have to wait for longer to see?
Well, I think that some of the cultural issues that President Trump mentioned will be advanced very quickly. That is pushing to get rid of so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in the U.S. government. Those are programs which have attempted to bring greater racial and ethnic balance to the workforce. I think Trump will push those aside very quickly. I think that there will be fast action to try to enforce immigration restrictions and expulsion of immigrants without the proper documentation. What I did not hear is very much about Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East, and I heard nothing about Russia's war against Ukraine, nothing about NATO.
Yes, we did in fact, sorry to interrupt you, but we did in fact hear about the release of the hostages. Mr. Trump took merit for that. He did mention,
yes.
But he did not give any specific solutions. And here in the studio, we were also observing the inaugural speech, and he did not in fact mention the war in Ukraine. So considering the situation on the old continent, considering the war on the eastern flank of the EU, of NATO, the war between Russia and Ukraine. How do you think those relationships with the EU are going to play out with the new administration?
I think that the Trump team is well aware that ending Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine will not be as easy as President Trump thought. The incoming NSC team, National Security Council team, seems to me to be pretty serious. I think they have a pretty good understanding of the issue. They understand it will be difficult, and that may be one reason that Trump didn't mention it, precisely because he won't be able to end it on day one. He could try to end it. He promised he would. And the only way to speed it up, well, one way to speed it up would be to push Ukraine into capitulation, which is Putin's desire. But I think that the Trump team understands that this would be a disaster, not simply for Ukraine and Europe, but also a disaster for Trump's presidency. So they may be considering more sustainable options for Ukraine. At least that's my hope.
As I spoke earlier to some of our experts, we've heard from Scott Lucas, and he mentioned that Trump doesn't really care about Russian influence in Europe. Would you agree with this statement, or is there something more to it?
I don't feel comfortable characterizing Trump's bottom line. It is a fact, though, that at the end of the day, he did support the Republicans voting to resume military assistance to Ukraine. And many people on his team are talking about a peace through strength solution for Ukraine. That is a ceasefire roughly along the lines of the current front lines, plus security for Ukraine. Now, that could be a pretty decent solution for Ukraine if we're serious about its security. So we will see what the Trump people want to do. But the fact that he didn't mention it in the inaugural might be a blessing, because had he mentioned it at all, he might have said things which would not advance European or Ukrainian security.
So you're looking at that development. Do I understand correctly that you're looking at this development as something positive, that he didn't mention it, because that opens the field to some other possibilities?
Well, I'm trying to look on the bright side, yes. But my view is colored by my conversations with some of the people from Trump's incoming team. They do seem to be aware that a lasting solution for Ukraine will have to include security for Ukraine. Now, if that's their understanding, I'm fine with it. The details will matter, but my sense of it is the Trump team, now the Trump administration, is thinking about Ukraine in a more realistic and sustainable way than I had feared 6 months ago. Mm-hmm. We'll see. That's not a promise. It's a hope, but it's not a hope based on nothing.
Let's, as you're a former U.S. ambassador to Poland, I wanted to focus more on Poland and the future of the relationship of the new administration, Donald Trump's administration, with the current Polish government. How do you think things will unfold in that relationship?
Poland has a lot of political capital, a lot of credit with the incoming Trump team. Quite frankly, they tend to look at Poland as the good European. Why? Because Poland spends a lot on defense, because Donald Trump himself visited Poland in 2017. I was there during that visit. He regarded it as a good visit. President Duda and President Trump have a good pre-existing relationship, and the Polish government knows America and Washington very well, particularly Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski. He knows us very well. So there's a good basis for cooperation between the U.S. and Poland. And the Trump administration, as I said, looks at Poland as a good European and solid partner. So this is a good basis.
So when we're looking at U.S. involvement here in the region, especially now that the war in Ukraine is raging, what policies do you expect, Mr. Trump, regarding U.S. military foothold in this area? Is there any way for the EU and the Polish government to actually speak to the new administration in order to convince them that this is going to pay back, because this is collective security?
The Polish government has an opening to talk seriously to the Trump people because Poland's military is serious. Poland's military buildup is serious. But Europe, and I mean the French and the Germans, are going to have to contribute more to Ukraine's security. Now, there is some talk. The British, the French have been talking about European forces inside Ukraine to advance a ceasefire or even to bolster Ukraine's resistance to Russian aggression. I think a European force after a ceasefire would be a major step, a difficult step, but it is one that could convince the Trump administration that Europe was serious. Now, I don't think any European government would go into Ukraine without a solid agreement about the U.S. backing them up. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm speculating about the future. But the Trump people will want Europe to step up and do more. Poland is poised to do more. Okay, it's a frontline state. So we're really talking about the French, the British, the Germans. And we should not necessarily wait for Putin's permission to do anything. We're going to need to support Ukraine's security. This will be very difficult, and all of us will have to put in a lot.
And I feel the sentiment in Europe also is, especially in the weeks leading up to the inauguration of Donald Trump, is that Europe has to be Trump-proofed, and Europe has to be able to stand on its own 2 feet. And I feel like this is something that we've also heard from the now President Donald Trump himself. Daniel Fried, former U.S. Ambassador to Poland, thank you so much for joining me on the program tonight.
Dziękuję.
Thank you. And so this would be all for now here on World Talks, but please do stay tuned here on TVP World. We're back in just a moment with more interviews and news.